I'm Greg Smith, and over the next year I'll be your guide around the world and back and forth through the ages as we discover the Catholic story and how the Church has preserved the faith once and for all given to the saints. Welcome to episode 5 of One Whirling Adventure. I'm really excited about what we have to share tonight, and this episode may be a little bit different than some of the others for some reasons I'll explain in a minute. You know, we have 3 types of episodes. We have uniquely Catholic objects, we have virtual pilgrimages, and then we have stories behind the saints. And that's what we've got tonight. Tonight we're going to try to understand the story behind Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. Now, you may know her by some other names, so let's just clear up that right out of the gate so we know who we're talking about. Thérèse of Lisieux she's called Thérèse of Lisieux because that's where she lived. She was a Carmelite nun who lived in a convent in Lisieux, France, which is in Normandy. Her birth name was Thérèse Martine, but she's also known as Thérèse of the Child Jesus and Thérèse of the Holy Face. Now, when the sisters would enter the convent, they would take a new name upon entering the convent. They would drop their family name, Martine, and she took the name of the child Jesus. And I'll explain why a little bit later. She also took the name of the Holy Face. So she's known as Thérèse of the Child Jesus and Thérèse of the Holy Face. Those were sort of her convent names. But she's most popularly known as Thérèse of Lisieux. Actually, the most popular name for her is a nickname. She's called the Little Flower. The reason she's called the Little Flower is Little Flower really was a metaphor for Thérèse's life and her message. If every flower wanted to be a rose, nature would lose her springtime beauty. She also said once that I am the smallest of creatures, and I recognize my worthlessness. But I also know how hearts that are generous and noble love to do good. In other words, I don't need to be measured by my deeds or the things that I accomplish, but just by the little love that I have. And it is the humility of Thérèse, the Little Flower, that strikes people. Well, anyway, before we get into the story behind the saint, let's cover some quick facts about her. So she was born in 1873 as Marie Martine to a middle-class French family in the Normandy region of France. Her father and mother owned a business. Actually, it was like a textile business. They made lace, and they worked together in that little business. And so she wasn't wealthy and she wasn't poor. It was kind of a comfortable middle-class existence in a beautiful countryside area in Normandy. She was one of 5 sisters. And 3 of the 5 sisters ended up entering convents. Her parents were deeply pious, faithful Catholic people. In fact, when they first met, they had endeavored to live together as brother and sister in a sort of consecrated life. But their priest, their confessor, encouraged them to have children. And they ended up having, I think it was 7 or 9 children, but some of them died in childhood. So anyway, Thérèse entered a Carmelite convent in Lisieux, also in Normandy, when she was 17 years old. And we'll talk about how that happened. She lived in the convent only 7 years. And at the age of 24, she contracted tuberculosis and died. That's it. She was a young child. She entered a convent at 17. She lived 7 years and passed away of tuberculosis in the convent at 24. That was the extent of her accomplishments. But after her death, a memoir that she had written kind of the story of her life to be shared with the other sisters in the convent, never intending it to be published, was sent around by the nuns to other convents as sort of an encouragement. Here's the story of one of our sisters. And other people got a hold of that manuscript, and it was published with the title, The Story of a Soul. And that book became an overnight sensation, published all around the world in multiple languages. People jumped on this book and were moved, deeply moved by it. And she became, after her death, basically an international celebrity in the Catholic Church. She was canonized in 1925. That's only 28 years after her death. Based on her book and a few other, this is mind-blowing too. Based on her book and a few other writings, some letters that she wrote and some poems that were published after her passing, in 1997, so exactly 100 years after her death, Pope John Paul II proclaimed Teresa to be a doctor of the church, one of only 36 doctors of the church in the entire 2,000-year history of the church, and only the fourth woman to be so. I'll explain a little bit more about the doctor of the church thing later in the episode. Her feast day is October 1. So that's some basics of the story. But now, the story behind the saint. As I prepared writing this episode, it struck me that this episode is an honor, it's an opportunity, and it's a tremendous challenge. Let me explain those. First, let me explain why it's such an honor to do this episode and to dedicate episode 5 of One Whirling Adventure to this saint. It's an honor because of all of the thousands of canonized saints in the Catholic Church. I think the estimate that I've read is there's close to 9,000 canonized saints in the church. And of those 9,000 saints, there are few, and I mean few, a handful, that are as popular and beloved as Thérèse of Lisieux, the Little Flower. People are attracted to the personalities of certain saints, and not just their accomplishments. I mean, some saints are known because they accomplished great things. They were popes who, did amazing things. They were missionaries. They were writers. My confirmation saint is Thomas Aquinas, who was another one of the 36 doctors of the church. But, people are drawn, including myself, why I asked for him to be my confirmation saint. People are drawn to Aquinas by his writings. They're impressed with his mind, not necessarily him as a person or his personality. But there are a few saints that are deeply beloved and deeply popular just because of who they were, what their personality was, who they were as a human being, and they resonate with people. People are drawn to and attracted to them. The one that I think of that comes most to mind, and maybe one of the only ones that's more popular than Thérèse because of his personality, was St. Francis of Assisi. People are just drawn to St. Francis of Assisi, not just because of what he did, because it's sort of who he was and how his personality and how his soul shone into his life. Well, Thérèse of Lisieux is like St. Francis of Assisi. She has that kind of, radiates that kind of charisma and popularity. There are a couple minutes on Google and you can read endless testimonies of how she's influenced and inspired people over the last 100 years, including a few popes and other saints. I mean, there are innumerable books and tracts and art, including her own books and poems. People are deeply devoted to this saint. And at her basilica in Lisieux, thousands, huge numbers, crowds visit Lisieux. In fact, she's probably the second most popular saint in France, maybe even the first most popular, along with Joan of Arc. Her relics and her mementos travel, and when they travel and when they've been sent around, huge crowds come to see them. And here's another thing that's amazing. She's not even the only saint in her nuclear family. This is incredible. Both of her parents are canonized saints. In fact, her parents are the only married couple ever to be canonized. And partly they've been canonized because they were the parents of Thérèse of Lisieux, the Little Flower, and modeled parenthood, or, were a model of parenthood for how they raised her. Here's another one. Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta, right? Mother Teresa. Her name originally was Agnes, but she took the name of Teresa in honor of the Little Flower from Lisieux. I mean, think about that. Not only is she as, a saint worthy and as popular as, Mother Teresa, but Mother Teresa named herself after Teresa of Lisieux. In fact, Pope Francis has said that Saint Therese is his favorite saint, and that he keeps a picture of her on his bookcase in his room. Pope Francis said a couple of things about her. One time he said, "Do not be afraid to depend solely on the tenderness of God, as Saint Therese of Lisieux did, who, for this reason, is a beloved daughter of the Blessed Mother and a great missionary saint." Love that quote. Don't be afraid to depend solely on the tenderness of God in the same way that Teresa of Lisieux did. But Pope Francis also said this, and this is astounding, and it's a sort of testimony to the devotion that people have to her. Pope Francis once said that when I have a problem, I ask the saint, Teresa of Lisieux, not to solve it, but to take it in her hands and help me accept it. So anyway, for all of these reasons, it's an enormous honor to tell the story and the story behind the story of this beloved saint. I said it's a tremendous honor, but it's also a tremendous opportunity. It's an opportunity in this episode to say something truly important. I like to think that in every episode of One Whirling Adventure, we're talking about deeply important things. But in this episode, trying to convey the message of this teenage girl in a convent from Lisieux is the opportunity to try to articulate something very, very profound and important. See, it raises this question, why? Why has this young girl who died at 24 and only ever made one, that we know of, one brief trip out of her native Normandy region of France. She may have made a trip to Paris once, but only one time did she ever really go on a trip anywhere. She went to Rome, and I'll tell the story about that in a minute. Why did this little girl, this young woman, who basically lived her whole life right in Normandy and inside the walls of a cloistered convent, have such an enormous impact on the world and the Catholic world? She didn't witness a Marian apparition like Bernadette of Lourdes or the Children of Fatima. She didn't do great works of charity like Mother Teresa did. And as we just pointed out, Mother Teresa named herself after Teresa of Lisieux. She didn't lead an army like St. Joan of Arc. She didn't get the Pope to return to Rome like St. Catherine of Siena, another doctor of the church. So why did she have such an impact? It's because she had something really important to say. Teresa of Lisieux showed us a way to God. Teresa of Lisieux showed us the little way to God. And today, as in 2020, we need the little way more than we ever did. For reasons I'll explain in this episode, we're living through things today that are very reminiscent of what they were going through at the time of her death and right afterward. And she captured the imagination of the Catholic world because her little way was a way forward. And it might be the best way for many of us, many of you who are watching right now, to grow with God during the days we live in now, is to pursue the little way of Teresa of Lisieux. Well, anyway, I said that tonight was an opportunity and an honor, but it's also a challenge. I see, as I prepared for this episode, I thought, this is going to be an enormous challenge. And here's why. And as I worked on it, I'm going to notice some things different about this episode than some of the others. First of all, our brains have been programmed around, in today's world, around narrative and action and movement and problem solving, all with amazing visuals. We've grown up in a television age, a movie age, an age where what we see is people going places and doing things and solving problems. And we live in a very visual age. This medium that we're using right now is a visual medium. And I try in One Whirling Adventure to give you a lot of exciting visuals, to go places, see things. That's kind of the norm for us, in the first part of the 21st century. But with Thérèse of Lisieux, the little flower, there's a huge problem. There's really nothing to see. There's really nothing to see. She was a young girl, teenager in Normandy, France, a middle-class girl in the countryside. She moved into a convent where she wore a habit. And really, she didn't travel anywhere. And she didn't do anything. So what do we show? And the story of Thérèse of Lisieux is not a story like some of the other episodes where we've seen saints who did amazing things and, fought off amazing challenges. Because the story of a soul, which is her book, is the story of the internal growth of in her towards God. And so there's really not a lot of visuals to show in this episode. And also this episode is a challenge for another reason. It's a challenge because the story of Thérèse of Lisieux, or Thérèse of Lisieux and who she was and what she's all about, is so far removed from the world we live in 2020. We live in a world that's technologically driven. We live in a world that is that has very different values, very different worldviews, and I'll explain some of that here in this episode. And the story of Thérèse of Lisieux, when you hear it and you immerse yourself in it, you feel like you're reading something or hearing something, from another age or another world. And so it's a tremendous challenge to try to communicate that, as opposed to, say, telling the stories of martyrs or missionaries or some of the other kinds of stories we've told in this program. And another challenge is that perhaps the most interesting part of the story, and I say that, I want to qualify that statement. Her story is interesting, but I got to be honest, I think the most interesting part of the story is the reactions to her story, the reactions to her life. As I explained, she's had this tremendous impact in the world. She's up there with Saint Francis of Assisi in terms of a saint that really moves people. And I think it's interesting and fascinating to ask why. What accounts for the reactions we have? Think about when she lived at the end of the 19th century, just on the turn of the 20th century. And it was right around the turn of the 20th century that people began to pay attention to her, and she was canonized. So, it's a fair question. Why did the whole world, or at least the whole Catholic world, look up from all that it was occupied with at the turn of the 20th century in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s? Think about what's going on. World War I was going on. The Soviet, revolution in Russia, the invention of the airplane, the Spanish flu was taking the lives of millions and millions of people around the world. And yet the world, in a sense, kind of stops and pays attention to a teenage girl living behind the cloistered walls of a convent in the countryside of Normandy. Why? What was so special about her? Why was she canonized? Why was she made of one of only 36 doctors of the church in 2,000 years? Well, that's what this episode is about. To understand all that, we're going to have to look at the story behind her. So here's what I think we're going to talk about tonight. There were, at the time that she lived and around the time of her passing, two huge forces that were colliding in French or at least European society at the same time. Imagine these two trains barreling down on each other for impact. And it creates this enormous shattering explosion, this enormous mess. It sort of shatters culture. It sort of shatters society when these two forces impact. And Thérèse of Lisieux showed sort of a third way out of that mess. You had force one and force two colliding, and she becomes this quiet little way out of the smithereens of society that all that produced. And that little way, as it's been called ever since, is the way that captured people's hearts and imaginations. And in a sense, it offered them a solution in the midst of these massive forces colliding that they had no control over. So anyway, here's the plan for the episode. We're going to look at those two huge colliding forces. We'll look at one, then we'll look at the other. And then we're going to turn to her little way as the solution to them and hear her story in that context. And I think we'll be glad we did. Because the same two forces that collided in France or European culture at that time 100 years ago are right now colliding in the American church. I mean, if you think about it, we're running, maybe a century behind, right? America is sort of getting to right now where European society was 100 years ago in terms of the cultural and religious forces at work. And so for us today, the American church today, St. Therese's little way is as much of a solution for us as it was for them at that time. So anyway, let's dive in and hear the story of these two massive forces that collided and the little way forward that she showed. The first of the two forces that were colliding in European society, particularly in France and Germany at the time of Therese's life and the generation just before it, was what we might call the death of God. Now, of course, God hadn't actually died, but the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, a generation before Therese, had famously declared that God is dead. Now, what Nietzsche meant by that was that the belief in God and God as an operating principle, which had governed Western society for thousands of years, was gone. The idea, the worship of God, even the belief in him as a philosophical principle. I mean, what Nietzsche said in his famous book on this topic was that the belief in God, and particularly the belief in the Christian God and Christianity, had provided not only faith and not only worship, but an organizing principle for the human mind. When you believed in God's existence and when you believed that God was a creator and that he had providence over the universe, it gave categories of knowledge. It meant that there was objective truth. It meant that one could investigate objective truth, whether through the sciences or through philosophical speculation. It meant that there were objective truths and ethics and morals. It meant that there were objective principles to learn in education. It meant that there were objective values that should organize how we understand and operate as a people. But what Nietzsche was saying is that in the 100 years prior to that, events and culture and thought in Europe, particularly in France and Germany, had sort of killed God as an operating principle. There no longer was belief in God at either the bedrock of society or its apex. They had become sort of a godless society. Now, let's be really clear. People like the Martins, Therese's family still believed in God. There were faithful believers out there, faithful Catholics. But remember, they were country people, middle-class country people living in Normandy. When you looked at the influencers of society, what we might call the elites, the university people, the government, the media, they had all given up on any belief in God. And it would produce what Pope Benedict called 100 years later, the dictatorship of relativism. You know, when there is no ultimate truth, there is no God that organizes and guides your your principles and your society and your values, then it's nihilism. It's moral anarchy. It's intellectual anarchy. Really what it is it's the assertion of power. When there's no truth that governs us, when there's no sense of shared values, there's no ultimate right or wrong, there's no objective truth and knowledge, then simply those who are most powerful, the elites who control the universities, who control the government, who control the schools, who control the media, will simply assert their opinions and their views. The mob, in a sense, will rule the public square. And so people like the Martins, people like her family can be faithful out in the countryside, but they're sort of the deplorables to the elites of French society and German society. Now, if some of this is sounding a little bit like what we're going through, as I said earlier, we may be 100 years or so, or maybe just 100 years behind where Germany and France were at the end of the 19th century. We have lost our faith in God as a society. We've lost our belief in him. He no longer operates as a guiding principle or an organizing principle in our thought and our ethics and our morality. And what we have now is a sort of intellectual and moral anarchy. And we're seeing the fruits of that. And that's what was going on at that time. It was becoming, or had already become, a post-Christian culture, a post-Christian society. Again, aside for faithful peasants like the Martins and what was left of the church hierarchy. So this sort of death of God, this loss of faith, it had begun with the French Revolution. I mean, during the French Revolution, you had a complete abandonment of God. For example, during the French Revolution, the elites and popular culture and the intellectual class had so completely abandoned God that they had stripped the churches. They'd outlawed the church. They put clerics to death. They put monks and nuns and priests to death. They eliminated the church as a functional entity in society. They smashed churches and religious art. In fact, the famous Cathedral of Notre Dame in the middle of Paris had been stripped of its art, and it had been turned into the Temple of Reason in the French Revolution. They had actually taken a French prostitute and installed her on the high altar at the height of the French Revolution in Notre Dame, and declared her the goddess of reason and the goddess of secularism. Coming out of the revolution, the French had determined to have a thoroughly secular society, what they called laïcité. It was a complete separation of church and state, more than even we just had in our founders, where we sort of separated the legal government from the legality of church. They were determined to keep the public square utterly secular. I mean, isn't that what we have now, where we've really stripped away every last vestige of Christianity and faith from the public square? That's what they were going through. And that post-Christian sort of death of God created a hunger, spiritual hunger in people, which led partly to the fascination with this young girl who found a way to find God in the little things. So there were these two great forces. Again, like I said, we think of them as two massive freight trains bearing down on each other in sort of German and French society in the late 19th, turn of the 20th century. The first was the loss of faith, the death of God, the loss of a post-Christian society, which creating a spiritual vacuum. The other one was the growth of technology and industrialization. So, of course, technology has always progressed, and but at times there have been these leaps. And what was happening in Europe in the late 19th century was these tremendous, not only leaps in technological inventions, but how those inventions were reorganizing the ways people lived. One of the most obvious examples of industrialization and the shift to industrialization in Europe in the 19th century, end of the 18th and throughout the 19th century, was people moving into cities for work, and sort of the elimination of country life or rural life as how things were organized. Now, it's not just that people were moving to cities, because of course people have done that on and off throughout the ages. I mean, the Roman world was more of an urban world. But what the move of industrialization was doing were particularly two things, and technology, or three things, was changing the way that people organize their lives. First of all, it led to the elimination or the destruction, or at least the erosion, of the nuclear family. So think about the rural family, and think about the Martins, Therese's family. They were these middle-class people living in sort of a bucolic Normandy, France. You have a mom and you have a dad and you have children in the home. And they live this family life, What happens was industrialization was forcing people to work in industrial ways in cities, which eroded the family's life together. So people were working outside the home. Mom works out the side of the home. Dad works outside of the home. The children work outside of the home. They no longer relate to each other in those ways. And so in a lot of complex ways, industrialization and technology was leading to the erosion of family life. Industrialization was changing society in some other important ways as well, technology. And one of them was this complex emergence of treating labor and people as a resource. So going back into time immemorial and the ages past, especially in the age of Christendom in the Middle Ages, and we can say a lot of things about the Middle Ages and serfs on farms and whatnot, but there was a notion that people worked for people. There was a sort of humanity. You knew the farm workers who worked for you. You existed in community. People were rooted to the land. And, we can look back at that and say, well, people were sort of tied to the land for labor, but by being tied to the land and tied into these relationships, community relationships, and the sort of the rural labor structures of the past, they also had a humanity to them. The land and people went together. People weren't interchangeable parts to simply be disposed of in an industrial machine. But that's exactly what industrialization did. I mean, when you think about industrialization, you had factories and somebody had to work at some, spot on a factory floor. And you could train this person to do it, and tomorrow you could train somebody else. And it's a little bit of that industrialization, that treatment of people as labor as interchangeable parts, that Catholic social thought, particularly the writings of Pope Leo XIII, began to push back against. He said what was really happening is that people were no longer living in any kind of a relationship of mutual honor and respect, but people were forced to work as parts in a machine, which dehumanized them, and it eroded the relationships that bound people together, and eroded the relationships between management and labor, between laborers themselves. And we see that today. I mean, when we think of the ways that we're treated in our technological society as sort of interchangeable parts, somebody else could be doing your job tomorrow. And so all you are is a commodity. That was one of the things that Pope Leo said, is that people, workers, labor is not a commodity to simply be switched in and out. So, plus you had these new technologies. I mean, manufacturing technologies, transportation technologies, communication technologies, which were sort of breaking down the old bonds of how we lived, with the effect that they were making people wealthier, society communicate more effectively, work more effectively, all the things that technology industrialization has done. But they were also causing people to, in a sense, become less human. Technology became something that, and industrialization caused us to be consumers or laborers. And so there was the collision of these two forces. On the one hand, you had the loss of God, the loss of Christianity, the emergence of a post-Christian culture, and what was really becoming nihilism and a spiritual wasteland. It created a tremendous hunger and vacuum in the human soul. It broke down morals, it broke down relationships, it broke down, and more importantly that, it broke down people's sense of meaning in life. Life became a meaningless struggle for pleasure or money, a meaningless competition. And that's what Nietzsche and these thinkers and things were happening. In fact, a lot of people have pointed out that World War I becomes this sort of crisis moment for European society, especially for French and German society, because what ends up happening is they see the effects of these forces at play, this giant, meaningless, mechanized, industrialized society simply bleeding people out. And the soldiers simply become commodities, in the trenches to go up over the side of the trench and plow into machine gun fire in no man's land. There's no humanity to it. Of course, the other thing is the emergence of the technology. So you have the machine guns, you have the growth of airplanes that can drop bombs on your head, you have the factories, you have industrialization, you have rapid communications, which begin in critical ways to break down the family, break down worship, break down other things. And so this giant relativistic society, feels this incredible ache of soul in its soul. It's struggling to find something to believe in and live for. And a little bit, right? That's what we're going through today. America, maybe 100 years behind France and Germany, finds itself in this crisis of spiritual crisis of a post-Christian culture, and nothing has replaced that. In fact, what we have is new strange gods, new strange religions in which we worship other sort of materialistic things or other spiritual values. There's nothing that binds us together or holds us together. There's no objective truth anymore. We don't even have the objective truth of gender, the objective truth of what's right or wrong. We have people arguing essentially that 2 + 2 = 5, that there is no truth. And really truth becomes and values become determined by those in positions of power who can wield control over education, government, media. This death of the soul is then compounded, and the power of those people who have that nihilistic influence over us is compounded by their ability to transmit it to us through technologies, which render us as commodities. We become commodities, spending ourselves on buying commodities. And so I think what we're seeing right now in America in 2020 and the problems that are playing out in America in 2020 on the news is the breakdown of order and a dictatorship of relativism and a descent into moral and spiritual anarchy. And in a sense, that's exactly what Western European civilization or culture was going through in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, as World War I, the Spanish flu, all of the industrialization of society was hitting. And that brings us to the sort of the third force, these two cataclysmic forces, or at least the third way out. And that's really what Thérèse of Lisieux brought. She showed another way forward. They could not then, and we cannot now, have control over these vast forces in our lives. Even the fact that we're having this interchange the way we are here, we're dependent on giant technology companies that are global. We're dependent on massive forces of government, massive forces of technology, massive forces of media. And we has a sense that none of us as individuals have any ability to change or shape any of that. I have no ability to change what Facebook or Google or the massive corporations that run the world or the massive government forces that run the world. I mean, I can complain about it and I can say things on my social media and I can complain, argue to my friends and I can shout at the TV. And a lot of us are doing that, but we have the sense that none of us have any control over the forces that shape us. And at the same time, there's this massive emptiness in our souls because we've lost God. And this massive emptiness in our souls because our families have broken down. We no longer have patterns of worship. We no longer have the quiet in our hearts and our souls and our lives to even hear him. We've lost the knowledge of how to pray. We've lost our knowledge of the word. And so we find ourselves with despair and a sense of powerlessness and a lack of agency. And that's what St. Thérèse of Lisieux shows us the way out of. Because most of us, I'm assuming nobody probably listening to this program, is going to affect those giant forces around us. It would be nice to imagine that God would raise up a champion or that one of us would be able to do something. But in a sense, we feel like we can do nothing. But Thérèse of Lisieux says there is something you can do. You can live to please God. And forsaking or realizing that we can't affect the big things in this world, we can control the little things in our lives. In fact, we can live for the little way. We can pursue the little way forward. And the little way forward is to rejoice in who God made us and to have control over the little things in our life and to have to control over the little things in our hearts and in our soul and the little things in the relationships with the people around us. And the great insight, the genius of Thérèse of Lisieux is that those little things are the big things that really matter. You know, we aren't going to change the giant corporations of this world or the giant governments of this world. But in the end, those things are chaff to the fire. Those things in the end are sandcastles. The things that endure for eternity are love and charity. We won't be judged by whether we, by God. We won't be judged by whether we change the politics or institutions of our world or the technologies of our world. We'll be judged by whether we mastered the little things. And those little things lead to the biggest thing of all, which is the kingdom of heaven. We know a great deal about Therese's inner life and thoughts because of her classic book, The Story of a Soul, which describes not action in the outside world, but the journey and development of her soul as she strove to follow Christ and to become a saint. Because at a very early age, it was Therese's ambition and desire to become a saint. She says that in the book. She told her parents that. You know, somebody once said, there's only one great tragedy in life: to have never been a saint. And Thérèse believed that. She, from a very early age, had an ambition of pleasing God and being found worthy of God and to achieve as much perfection in her relationship with Christ as possible. And she aspired to sainthood. Now, she was born into a pious and loving Catholic family, the Martins. In her book, Thérèse recalls the beauty of her childhood with loving Catholic parents and 5 sisters in the beautiful French countryside of Normandy. In fact, her parents, interestingly, when they met, were such pious Catholics that they endeavored to live together in a married state only as brother and sister, until they told their parish priest and confessor, who advised them against that, and they began to enter, and then they began to have children. But she was born into a pious and loving Catholic family, the Martins. In her book, Thérèse Martin recalls the beauty of her childhood with loving Catholic parents and 5 sisters in the French countryside of Normandy. But this idyllic childhood was broken by the early death of her mother from breast cancer. When she was only 4 years old, she felt the pain of separation, And as a 4-year-old child, she instinctively turned to the Virgin Mary. After the death of her mother, St. Teresa's life, as she describes it, was a period of inner turmoil, a tremendous sense of loss of her mother, a tremendous sense of how to find her place, and a lot of frustration and anger and selfishness. She was unhappy at school, where her natural precociousness and her piety made the other school children jealous. Eventually, her father agreed for Thérèse to return home and be taught by her elder sister, Céline. She loved being taught at home, but after a while, her older sister decided to leave home and enter the local Carmel convent at Lisieux, the convent that Thérèse herself would enter later. And this made Thérèse feel like she'd lost her mother all over again. As a child, Thérèse experienced a painful illness in which she suffered delusions. The doctors were kind of at a loss to the cause. They didn't know exactly what was wrong with her. For 3 weeks, she suffered from a high fever. Eventually, she felt completely healed after her sister placed a statue of the Virgin Mary at the foot of the bed. Thérèse felt her health and mental state returned to normal very quickly. You know, these kinds of stories perhaps don't resonate with us as modern readers. We think about this child and she sounds perhaps neurotic to us, fixated on statues of the Virgin Mary. But you see, this is exactly the wonder of Thérèse of Lisieux, is that there was a simplicity to her soul. Thinking on the Virgin Mother, thinking on the Blessed Mother of Christ made her feel happy. And, you know, we're inclined to sort of in our cynical way dismiss that as neurosis or psychological imbalance or overly, the imagination of an overly pious child. But what was wrong with it? She was a young girl. She had lost her mother, and she turned to the Blessed Mother, and that gave her joy and made her feel peace. And really, she was, again, showing us that simple way forward, that our cynical minds and our sort of cynical attitudes, modern attitudes, can't resonate with. In her book, The Story of a Soul, she recalls Christmas Eve of 1884, and she calls that evening her conversion. It's an interesting story. French children at the time would place their shoes on the hearth on Christmas Eve, and during the night, supposedly, the child Jesus would come and put little presents in the shoes. Thérèse was getting a little bit too old for this, her father thought, and so she placed her shoes on the hearth and went upstairs to her room. When her father came home from a busy day of work, he saw Thérése's shoes and kind of in an exhausted, frustrated comment, said something about Thérèse is getting a little bit too old for this sort of thing, and I hope that I don't have to go through this next year. The kind of thing that any kind of a working man might snap or a working parent might snap when they come home at the end of a long day. Thérèse overheard the comment through the walls up in her room. At first, she was mortified. Here was her loving father sort of saying something harsh and irritating, and she realized that she was frustrating her father. And she felt very sorry for herself. But in this sort of breakthrough moment, all of a sudden she realized that it wasn't about her and that she couldn't take any offense. And so in a sort of humble act of domestic piety, she went downstairs and greeted her papa and showed him kindness and love and charity and sort of forgot all about his irritated comment. Now, that might be the kind of thing that we just brush off and think nothing of. But think of it, she called it as her conversion because she resolved that was the last time in her life that she would take umbrage from another person. Thérèse said that from that point on, she lost her inclination to please herself with her own desires. She says that she lost her child immaturity and she felt a strong calling to enter the convent at the unprecedented early age of 15. She said that she felt a burning desire to do something great for the kingdom of God by praying for the souls of others so she could forget herself. Now, the vocation of the Carmelite sisters in Lisieux was exactly that, the convent that her sisters had entered and that she wanted to enter. It was to pray for priests and missionaries. And she saw this as her vocation, her mission, her joy was to pray for others and not for herself. And so she kept persistently pestering the nuns who ran the convent and the local priests and the bishop to make an exception and let her enter the convent at the age of 15. As I said, two of her sisters had already gone into religious life, one at the Carmelite house in Lisieux and another at a different convent nearby in Normandy. Now, initially, the church authorities at the convent, at the diocese, refused to allow a girl who was so young to enter holy orders. They advised her to come back when she was 21 and all grown up. However, Therese's mind was made up. She couldn't bear to wait. She felt God was calling her to enter the cloistered life. Now, around this time, her father took her on a trip to Rome. And while they were there, they attended the Pope's weekly public audience. So she approached Pope Leo XIII in the receiving line. Back then, apparently, you could do that. And she knelt for a blessing. But then Thérèse broke protocol. And she asked the Pope for permission to enter the convent early and for him to instruct the church authorities back in Normandy to let her do so. Now, Pope Leo is an old man at this point. He doesn't know this girl from Adam. And so here she is begging him for this at his feet. And he's kind of taken back. And so the Pope replied, "Well, my child, do whatever the superiors decide." But then she wouldn't leave his feet. I mean, she lay there clinging to his feet, begging him to let her into the convent until the Swiss guard had to drag her away. Well, eventually the authorities back in Normandy relented, and they let her enter the Carmelite convent in Lisieux when she was 17 years old. And her heart's desire was fulfilled. Now, when the sisters entered the convent, they dropped their family name and they took on a consecrated religious name. So Thérèse Martin became Thérèse of the Child Jesus. And why she did this is instructive and an insight into her little way. She dedicated to herself to contemplating the Christ child, not in a sentimental Christmas way, but reflecting deeply on the mystery of the incarnation, that God had made himself small and vulnerable and poor. By taking the name Thérèse of the Child Jesus, she took into her own identity the mystery of that love, that humility. God himself had taken a little way. At the Mother Superior's urging, she also took the name Thérèse of the Holy Face. This was to contemplate the face of Jesus after his passion, beaten, spent, given up for others. Those were two reminders for her. Well, anyway, convent life was hard. It was cold. They only heated one room in the whole building. And it was disciplined. And between prayers, they had to do work. And she corresponded with the priests and missionaries around France and overseas that she prayed for. Not all the sisters liked her. Some saw her as a spoiled middle-class girl. But she won them over with her joy and her selflessness. I mean, just goodness radiated from her and attracted everyone who met her. Thérèse always sought ways to respond to criticism and gossip with the attitude of love. No matter what others said, Thérèse responded by denying her own sense of ego. At one point, a nun who had criticized Thérèse often said, "Why do you always smile at me? Why are you always so kind, even when I treat you so badly?" Thérèse believed that if we can maintain the right attitude, then nothing shall remain that can't be accomplished. Well, when she was 24, she contracted tuberculosis and she died of the illness. Towards the end of her life, when she was increasingly bedridden, St. Thérèse was encouraged by the elder nuns to write down her ways of spiritual practice. And so she wrote 3 short memoirs or tracts that explained her little way and included her sort of autobiography and some notes from her diary. Those were bound together. Well, what happened was after her death, the writings were passed around avidly and read by the other nuns in the Carmelite community. And although it was initially intended only for that small audience, the manuscript got out, somebody read it, and it was published. And it has been frequently republished so many times since then, the book Story of a Soul. And in 1997, St. Pope John Paul II declared her one of only 4 female doctors of the Catholic Church. There have been 36 doctors in the church in total in the last 2,000 years. And so thus, after her death, she was able to achieve her intuitive feeling that she would someday be able to do something important and help save souls by doing the little things well. St. Therese reminds us that while we may not be able to control the big things in life, we can be faithful with the little things. And in the end, that's the biggest thing of all.